Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video. This is a frontline update for the 19th of February 2023, a little bit later than I normally would do, Sundays, hey? Anyway, let's get straight to it. We're going to go to the front line straight away. I'm going to throw in a couple of extras maybe at the end of the frontline update. So Kupiansk to Svatove to Kreminna. This is where we're going to go to first, and on my map that looks like this. We've got Kupiansk up here and the settlements to the north where there's quite a bit of activity going on, down to Svatove here. The news is fairly thin on the ground. There is claims again. Hryaniivka, sorry, has been taken by the Russians. It's controlled by the Russians. And they are fighting in the direction of Sinkivka. Some maps have Sinkivka under Russian control. Rebar have Russian. That there's kind of basically that's the line of their that's the front line sort of going through Sinkivka. But most sources that I think are slightly more trustworthy have, fighting going near Sinkivka. Anyway, what does ISW say is aggregating these different sources? A Russian mail blogger expressed doubt that Russian forces could take Kupiansk, despite Russian claimed capture of Hryaniivka. ISW has no independent verification that Russian forces have seized Hryaniivka. I think that although they might not have sort of visual evidence of that, I think the amount of sources and even people like Deep State's map, which is pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian mapper, has Hryaniivka under Russian control. So I think that's probably safe to say. Sinkivka, I think, is another matter, and I think there's probably fighting on the outskirts there. There's pushing coming down from Vilshana and through Liman Pershi, but not too much detail otherwise. In fact, no real detail coming down this entire front line until we get to the Kreminna area. So we're going to go past all the kind of Kuzmivka, Kovalivka, all these sort of places, and then around Ploshchanka, Chervonopopivka, a bit of activity going on there. So in fact, we go to No Reports that says today was a relatively quiet day. Pro-Ukrainian source here, Serhiy Khaidai, head of the military administration of the Luhansk region, said that Russia continued its attacks around Kreminna unabated. Its use of electronic installations to disrupt Ukrainian drones. It uses them, so that's a really important component of their offensive and defensive. Really, electronic warfare. Drones are so important for conducting artillery, for conducting reconnaissance. That if you can knock out the use of drones, you have a serious advantage. So electronic warfare is super important. But there are no reports of a breakthrough so far, he says, and indeed there isn't too much to report. I'm going to take you to Poulet-Volant's maps that I think are quite visually arresting and clear. So again, there's the activity going up near Kupiansk in and around Sinkivka and Liman Pershi, and we come further down south. We have a movement going westwards, but I don't think there's been any particular gains over the last sort of 24, 48 hours that I've noted on my map. I mean, this gain that Poulet-Volant shows is the game from the 31st of January. So that's actually 19 days. So that's interesting to note that if this is the actual big offensive, 19 days they've taken this amount of land, which is not impressive. The question is, as I keep saying every video, is this the offensive or is it a pre-offensive offensive? And you have lots of people in the intelligence communities, national intelligence communities, saying this is the offensive, and then others saying they are massing. In fact, there's news, again, further news that they're amassing aircraft at the other side of the border, and that there could be a really big push coming. There are troops amassing in Zaporizhia, apparently. So anyway, I'll come to that at the end of the video. So that's the claims around Kreminna are pretty low on the ground. Defmon, one of my usual pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian sources, is not really reporting this weekend. Too busy at the moment. And Rebar don't actually say anything until you get to Bakhmut. ISW mentions all the usual places. Repelled attacks around Bilarivka. We've got Zarichna, Yampalivka, Balka-Zaravka Gully. And another mill blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces attempted to regain lost positions near Ploshchanka. Actually, that's on the 17th. That's a Rebar video that stated that. Chervonopopivka. So all the usual places, but not a lot of change, really. Luhansk, again, administration head Khaidai has said that they've not made advances near Kreminna, but have intensified artillery fire around there. So possibly some pushback from but this is coming from Rebar. Possibly some pushback from Ukrainians around Ploshchenka, but otherwise, sort of, repelled attacks everywhere, and not a lot of territorial change. Rebar's map has Bilorivka under the Russian control, but I don't think that is the case, and I'm pretty sure it remains under Ukrainian control. But it is tough around Bilorivka. There's no doubt about that. And then we come down to Bakhmut, where there is quite a bit of information and claims from either side. If we look at Poulet-Volant's map, as we come down to the northern area, we have the pushback not pushback, so the offensive of the Russians is taking place in Fedorivka here and towards Vesely, up in this northern area, and that's up towards Siversk. So just to put you in the context of my map, that would be pushing here northwards towards Siversk as they try and come down through Bilorivka as well. So Yakovlivka towards Vesely and Krasnopolivka towards Rozdilivka here. That's the pushing going on there. But there's a lot to be said for what's going on around this M03 or E40 road coming into the north of Bakhmut here, and a lot of fighting taking place in Bakhivka. So if we go and look at Suryak maps, this is a pro-Russian mapper saying that actually the Russians have gained some territory north of Bakhivka. This is a Stupka suburb of Bakhmut here. Some gains around there taking place. Indeed, No Reports says just north of Bakhmut, the fighting is now mainly taking place in the southern part of Paraskevivka. In addition, Wagner tries to force a breakthrough to Berkivka and Zalizhnyansk, and the fighting there takes place in immediate areas around the M03. So going back to the Suryak maps, they are indicating, in fact, they say here that there's a tough pushback for the Ukrainians in the Berkivka area. They say the Russians have made advances in the Stupka district while their troops are trying to enter Bakivka town, but it's being strongly defended by the Ukrainian army. Poulet-Volant's map has the Ukrainians pushing back into Stupka, but I think that may be out of date, or at least the subsequent claims from Russians are that they have made advances in that area. And in fact, if we look at my map here, all of this road, as according to Russian claims, is now under Russian control, pretty much from really directly south of Zalizhnyansk all the way to Pidorodna. Whereas, so this part of the road here on the Poulet-Volant map is still under Ukrainian control. And actually, this is a recent map from Poulet-Volant. These are from today, from this morning. So there is some discrepancy there between sort of Russian, and I don't really know where Poulet-Volant sits as far as being pro either side. But certainly that may or may not be under Russian control. ISW talk about, let's go to look at the ISW claims. So let's look and see what Rebars say about Solidar direction, as they call it, Bakhmut. In the north, after liberation of Paraskevivka, the assault detachments of the Wagner are attacking the northwestern suburb of Bakhmut, Bakhivka. Several important highways pass through the village, through which the supply of the group passes. Now, I don't think that's going to be the case anymore. Now, fierce battles are taking place on the eastern outskirts, where the Ukrainian formations were pulled after the withdrawal from Paraskevivka. I think that's highly unlikely. So Paraskevivka falls, you're hardly likely to get the Ukrainian units pulling out of Paraskevivka and then suddenly being pulled to the eastern suburbs. That's never going to happen. So they will be pulled back to Berkivka or back for reconstitution. There will be other forces working in the east. I can't imagine that Rebar are correct in those claims. Also, Russian fighters occupied one of the hills north of the village, trying to break through the defensive lines of the armed forces of Ukraine. In addition, the Wagnerites managed to advance a little in the Stupka area after establishing control over Paraskevivka. The tactical position of Russian fighters on the northern outskirts of Bakhmut improved significantly. And this is what Suryak is saying there, that this is the northern part of Stupka, where they've come from Paraskevivka down to Stupka. So that would make sense. Positional battles continue in Bakhmut itself as a result of fighting on the west of the Champagne factory. The assault detachments of the Wagner PMC are able to knock out the armed forces of Ukraine from several positions in this quarter. On the southern and southwestern outskirts of the city, the Wagnerites went to Radyansky Lane and the side of the experienced and also moved closer to the Bakhmut cemetery. Okay, so this is saying that according to Reba, of course, that there's a little bit of gain in Stupka there, but also in the eastern area near the Art Winery. So there's some gains here by the Russians. If you go back to Syriac maps, actually they will claim that that is the case. So there's as they move past the Art Winery here. So this is flipped 90 degrees, so they're actually moving. This road comes in from the east to the west, and they've gained a little bit of ground, as according to them, in that position, which would be coming from the east, gaining some ground there just below the Art Winery, that red roof that you can see, long red roof there just to the south. That's according to them. So Syriac, there's a red roof just coming in there, a little bit of gain in that area. And then when we come down south of Bakhmut, there's some gain in Opitny, and this is towards, you can see that there is this large sort of set of units or farm warehouses or whatever, buildings to the south of the cemetery. There's some gain around there. And indeed, that seems to be what Rebar is saying in what they've claimed towards the Bakhmut cemetery. Interesting, it's towards the cemetery, whereas just to go south on my map, this is the cemetery here. That actually there were claims that it was in the cemetery pretty much last week, but now it's towards the cemetery. So, maybe walking back a few claims. Anyway, ISW says geolocated footage on February 18th indicates that Russian forces likely secured marginal advances northwest of Bilorivka. That's the one near Bakhmut and near Rozdilivka. So just to go back, sorry, because I'm trying to do each individual source at a time. So they're saying that there are some claims around some gains around Bilorivka for the Russians and around Rozdilivka, but that's kind of unspecified at the moment. And then they go on to talk about geolocated footage published on February the 17th shows Russian forces closer to Zalizhnyansky and the section of the E40 highway north. So that's around here. And I've kind of adapted my maps to show that. So they are pretty close to that settlement. And indeed, Bakhivka, a lot of fighting around there. And then it goes on to mention a couple of geolocated bits of footage here. So geolocated footage published on the 18th indicates that Russian forces likely secured marginal advances in the eastern outskirts of Bakhmut. So that's interesting, because I have, on the eastern outskirts of Bakhmut, right, I have some Russian sources saying that this is the amount of territory that they now have. And I have Poulet Volant, for example, saying on their Bakhmut map, saying actually the Ukrainians are pushing back to the north, to the east, and to the south. And their map has the Russians almost back to Maximienka Street there, which is this street on here. So Poulet Volant has the Russians right back here. Syriac maps and Rebar has them over here. And the geolocated footage that ISW are talking about, showing a marginal advance on the eastern outskirts, is actually this footage. It's being geolocated to here. So let's see where that search was. Is this one? So this is the geolocated. So that doesn't show marginal advances. That shows actually that Russians are further back than they've been claiming for the last sort of week. So that would fit in line with what Poulet Volant's saying, that in fact the Russians are back here, or at least there, right? So I don't know how accurate it is that the Russians are this far forward. Then ISW goes on to say, geolocated footage published on the 17th, so it's 2 days ago, indicates Russian forces have advanced closer to the highway northeast of Klishchivka. So this is the idea that the Russians were pushed back. Sorry to flip around so much. I just want to deal with these sources. The idea is that the Russians were pushed back near Ivanivska, and you've got this. So if you go to the Poulet Volant map, you've got this pushback from the yellow arrow there happening around Ivanivska. But possibly the Russians have subsequently done a counteroffensive around there, and they've advanced closer to the T0504 highway, this highway again. And the footage that they geolocate. So this is what the ISW, the first one, ISW is around there. That's that geolocated footage showing that actually. Oh no, sorry. That was a geolocated footage showing that it was backed by Maximienko Street. And then the second piece of geolocated footage that ISW is talking about having the Russians advance closer to Ivaniska is actually this claim here. So we go to recent searches, and it is this one. So where is that? Well, actually, I don't think that suggests that they have got closer to T0504 highway. I think that just means they're fighting closer to the cemetery. So I'm not wholly worried, particularly from a Ukrainian point of view, that the Russians are like pushing back closer to the highway. Although they do have, there is a little bit of an adjustment in the map here. They are close to, or at least confirmation they are close to that cemetery. So we shall see what happens, whether the Ukrainians are successfully pushing back here, whether the Russians are stopping that Ukrainian gain around the southwest. If we go to No Reports, says to the southwest of Bakhmut, the situation is actually much better. So he's very positive about the Ukrainian position. It became even more positive since yesterday, and the Russian troops have not been so far from the highway as in the past 1 to 2 weeks. Their advance there seems to have stopped for the time being. So this would sometimes, ISW is a little bit behind on some of the sources. So, and it will date it like February the 17th, so that's actually 2 days ago. Whereas now No Reports are saying from yesterday is looking more positive in that southwest area in the Ivaniska. Goes on to say there are also developments in the south of Bakhmut, but it's too early to report on. In the eastern parts of Bakhmut, fighting takes place in Zabamutka district between Ivano-Franka and the Maximienko Street. The Ukrainian reclaimed some blocks there. Fighting is still fierce. So let's just have a little look at his map. So his map has, so if you can remember, let's go back there. Let's go back to this area here. So I think my map here is far too generous for the Russians, or at least there are conflicting reports. So Syriac maps will have this. Poulet-Volant has this, but then grey zone till back here, and the Russians back here. Now, No Reports says actually, so this is that Maximienko Street on the far east, and it has then 2 blocks, 2.5 blocks, 2 to 3 blocks in from there. So at the most, he has the Russians here, and then grey zone here, and then the Ukrainians probably where I've got them pretty much. So here it is dynamic. It is possible that, as Poulet-Volant has indicated here, that the Ukrainians have pushed back the Russians there, but the Russians are pushing pushing westwards for just to the north of there in the Art Winery area here. So the Russians may have well made some gains here. Ukrainians could be pushing back here, and indeed they could be pushing back in the Opitny area, although I've shown today, I've adapted my map that the Russians have got this extra land. They were here, so the Ukrainians were holding them here, and then they've pushed further to the north there. So it's a bit of push and shove, quite dynamic in Bakhmut. Things are happening. Different sources will say different things, but as interestingly, in the southwest of Bakhmut, says Reba, positional battles with the use of artillery continue. So in that Ivaniska area, he's saying that clashes are taken on the outskirts, but it is kind of more positional battles, which is interesting because that's not the kind of fighting that we've seen over the last week in the Bakhmut area. Is that an admission? Basically, positional battles could be an admission that the Russian have been pushed back in that Ivaniska area. Anyway, that's Bakhmut for you. I expect there's going to be quite a lot of news coming out of here over the next week, of course, because this is the most dynamic area on the battlefield. On the front line, you will see probably Russians really putting a lot of pressure on the north, and the Ukrainians putting a lot of pressure on the south, possibly in the east as well. And one would assume that if they're bothering to do this in the south and the east, they're probably piling in some troops to the north as well. Because if Bakhivka goes, then and Yahidny gets under increasing pressure from this northern push into the Stupka suburb, then actually, it seems rather pointless to try and defend so much down here. The north is just getting lost, and this main supply route coming in for the Ukrainians here becomes, under pressure from a Russian advance from Bakhivka. So if the Russians were to take Bakivka and even Yahidny as well, then it could be it could be easier for the Russians to then march in and cut off, interdict that supply route into Bakhmut. Anyway, yes, let's move a little further south. Let's zoom out of Bakhmut, come further down south, past Shumi and New York. And actually, we're just going to stop a little bit around Nova Bakhmutivka and Alexandropil because put a Volon's map here before we get down to Avdivka, which is surrounded there. Again, a lovely clear map. You can see that Nova Bakhmutivka has been, over the last 20 days, been taken by the Russians. So there is an advance there, and they are pushing towards the north, towards Alexandropil, and then to the west as well, and as well towards another Vasile from Novoselivka Druha. So on my map, that is pushing towards from Novoselivka Druha to Vasile and indeed Krasnohorivka, which is another Krasnohorivka. There are plenty of them. So there's quite a lot of activity around here, quite a bit of pressure. And again, this is going to be part of that northern push to get that larger encirclement of Avdivka, since they can't really make many inroads much closer to Avdivka, such as around here. They lost an awful lot of troops and hardware there last week or the last couple of weeks. They're still pressuring Vodyane, Pervomaisky, all the normal places that you'll have mentioned, Vodyane, Avdivka, and so on and so forth, but not too much news really to come out of there. We come further down south past another Krasnohorivka to Marinka, and the idea is that, well, in fact, we'll read a bit of what ISW say about Avdivka, sorry, Marinka. So a Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces advanced on the northern outskirts of Marinka, and I showed you that on the previous couple of days, and that Russian forces aim to encircle the settlement instead of continuing frontal assaults on Ukrainian positions in the western part of the settlement. Absolutely makes perfect sense. Geolocated footage published yesterday shows the DNR 1st Army Corps 3rd Brigade shelling Ukrainian positions near Novobakhmutivka. So we've just gone past there. So that's actually flipping back to the north then. But yeah, so you can see that Marinka is again under pressure, and that pressure is predominantly coming from the north and the south rather than in the center. Poulet Volon's map, if we come to have a look at it, going to Marinka, which is down here, has, again, you can see the pressure all along these different places. So just north of there towards Novelska, that's the one that's kind of dug in fairly well, and you have these sort of entrenchments and fortifications built there. And then towards Krasnohorivka, and this attempted encirclement of Marinka from the north to south whilst pushing in the middle. And we have this kind of little salient they have indicated here just underneath that arrow. Theirs is not as wide as my one, a little sort of salient towards into these sort of this piggery and the agricultural warehouses there. But that other than that, not too much news specifics out of there, and then quite a bit of activity, I believe, around Novomykhailivka, and as we come further down south towards Vuhledar. No reports says Russia reportedly resumed attacks northeast of Vuhledar near Novomykhailivka. Yesterday, an attack was repelled there by the AFU. Nothing today. Nothing is known so far, so I don't know what the outcome of that is. But that is this attack around Novomykhailivka. And just to remind you of the topographic scenario just down there. So as you can see from my map, Novomykhailivka here is in a sort of river valley. This waterway goes to the west, east-west here, and Vuhledar is on higher ground that looks down to lower ground in Pavlivka and Mikilska. So Vuhledar there, Novomykhailivka up there, and actually this is sort of if they can break here, then they can go down this sort of river valley and start this larger encirclement of Vuhledar, which is on that higher ground. So this is a topographic map. You have Novomykhailivka on this lower ground, those other sort of towns on that river valley I was talking about. And as we sort of come further down here, that is Vuhledar. It looks like, in the Cyrillic writing, looks like Burner Gap. So that is Vuhledar, and as you can see, it's on this higher ground that looks down on Pavlivka and Mikilska just here. Uh, and if the Russians can either do this larger encirclement and come up behind, they'll still be on lower ground, but obviously they'll be able to encircle, or it's further to the east of Vuhledar, so just around here. If they can get on high ground around here, then they can be on the same level as Vuhledar and take it. But they're struggling really to get further north of Mikilska and Volodymyrivka there as well. So that's the topographical situation around there. But just to give you that, there's actually not a lot of information coming out from Vuhledar area. Otherwise, Ukrainian General Staff reported that they've repelled Russian assaults near Vuhledar. Russian sources claim that Russian forces are attempting to conduct offensive operations from Mikilska, just to the south, as I've shown you, and that positional battles are ongoing around Vuhledar. Odessa Oblast head Serhiy Bratchuk amplified footage on February 17th, so 2 days ago, showing Chechen Akhmat special forces reportedly deploying to positions in the direction of Vuhledar. So that's interesting. So Chechens, the Akhmat special forces there. Anyway, as we come out of Vuhledar, because other than those general sort of ISW claims, there's not too much detail coming out of there. All Zaporizhia and indeed Kherson, there's some normal artillery duels. There is. Well, let me go to ISW to let you know what they said. So, Ukrainian forces reportedly conducted 70 fire missions striking Russian positions and equipments on the east or left bank of the Dnipro River. So, there is activity going on there. And indeed, if we look at here, we have in Tavrisk, in the occupied part of Kherson region, a Russian ammo site was covered. Sounds of detonation are heard. So that is Novokukovka, just down there. You've got Tavrisk as part of that. Yeah, there it is, Tavrisk. So yeah, activity happening there. I'm going to show you a couple of things. Well, let's go through a bit of video first. So at least 43 busloads of Wagner forces have been observed arriving near the Zaporizhia front over the last few days. Estimates include that these buses have transferred around 2,000 to 3,000 troops in the region. And that is very significant, obviously. So I showed you those buses in transit. Well, here they are parked up. Russian Federation has accumulated 450 aircraft and 300 helicopters 200 kilometers from the border with Ukraine, and there's another report saying they've done that to keep them out of range of retaliatory strikes, which is why, as Trentelenko says here, it's important to have Storm Shadow or ATACMS or something that can reach them at a 300-kilometer range. Strong fires broke out and temporarily occupied Berdyansk on the Zaporizhia region, local channels report. So whether that's a HIMARS strike or whatnot, I don't know. So Berdyansk is there. It's the port between Mariupol and Crimea, closer to Mariupol, and so talking about those busloads of Wagner troops, ISW has a very interesting bit of discussion here. So Russian forces are continuing to reinforce defensive positions in occupied Zaporizhia. Ukrainian mayor of Melitopol, Ivan Fedorov, published footage showing 43 buses with Wagner group personnel moving via Melitopol in the Zaporizhia direction. Geolocated footage also showed servicemen with Wagner uniforms and symbology at a bus stop in Melitopol. The Ukrainian General Staff previously reported on the 11th that Wagner recruited 1,200 convicts in occupied Crimea. But the relationship between the two reports is unclear at this time. Wow, so I actually didn't know that. The 1,200 prisoners from Crimean prisons have been recruited to Wagner, and now we're seeing busloads of Wagner prisoners. Oh, sorry, busloads of Wagner soldiers. We don't know if those two are connected. Fedorov also reported that Russian forces have also deployed mobilized men from Vladivostok to Melitopol and are studying underground tunnels in Melitopol, possibly or for fortification purposes. Fedorov added that Russians are using sea shipping containers to build fortifications near Novomykhailivka. So we talked about Novomykhailivka before. That's just there. So using shipping containers for fortifications. So anyway, lots of activity going on in this area. Are those troops being sent to the front lines? Are they being used in defensive capacity, capability around the Zaporizhia Oblast in general? Are they expecting this to be the area that the Ukrainians attack, or are they preparing themselves for an offensive? I don't know. But anyway, that's the news. That's a Frontline update. This is me, Jonathan MSP, saying thank you very much for your support. Please like, subscribe, and share. All the details of how you can support the channel are in the description below. In the meantime, thank you very much. Take care. Goodbye.